Welcome back to another episode of Psychocinematic. Today, my guest has been in the works of coming on this podcast for months, and I couldn't be more excited to have him on. He is a New York Times bestselling author and a former Navy SEAL sniper. His name is Jack Carr, and he's here to talk to me about the Terminal List book series and the TV series, as well as the Dark Wolf spin-off series. I'm not sure how much he'll be able to divulge on that, but without further ado, here's Jack. Jack, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I know you're super busy and you just finished writing Red Sky Mourning, and so I'm sure just the line of press that you have to do leading up to it's insane, but I can tell you that I have many a friend who is super jealous I get to talk to you right now.
Oh man, no, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it. Well, here it is right here, actually. It's right, this is what it looks like for anyone interested. My last look. And usually I
Holy
find
crap.
it, but I was in New York for the 100th anniversary of Simon and Schuster. There was a big event they did back there. And so I couldn't take it. What I usually do is I bind it. So it's just easier to control, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But they delivered it to my hotel instead, and so it was the longest one yet. It
Yeah.
became the longest one yet. You kind of can't control how long the story is going to be. The story just dictates it as you're writing.
hmm
It ended up being the longest yet.
How many words do you know?
It is. I'm meaning to ask, because you do your last couple passes of edits in PDF, like in Adobe
hmm
Acrobat. So it's not like as easy as looking down. I think there's a way, but I'm going to ask Simon and Schuster if they can tell me the exact word count, because once you put it into PDF, it has the title in there. It adds like the title page and
hmm
copyrights and all those other things. So I'm not sure if those words get in there, but it is. Last I checked on Word before it got transferred over to PDF, it was 145-ish
Wow.
words. Usually books like these are about 105 to 115,000 in there. My last
hmm
couple have been longer than that, but yeah, about 145,000 words, which is a lot longer than I anticipated at the outset, which is why it took so long.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you this later, but since we're on the topic of it, so I saw you had author Terry Hayes on your podcast. I had him on as well, and I'm not sure if he said it on yours, where he said that his book, The Year of the Locust, was like 270,000 words, but he ended up cutting out like 800,000 because it was a little over a million. And when I heard that, my mind was blown. Do you write similarly to that, where you're just like scrap, scrap, scrap?
Not yet, not yet. That would be very difficult. I mean, there's some things you take out a sentence or a paragraph or something that's
hmm
just not working. But at this stage, with so much going on, I haven't had really the luxury to be able to write a ton and then edit it out. It's more just writing the story, and everything that goes into that story ends up actually in it for the most part. Since the beginning, the notes that I've gotten from my editor, that's the same thing as Terry Hayes' editor, Emily Bessler Books, Atria Simon and Schuster, same publisher editor, have been like, hey, describe this for someone who didn't spend 20 years in the SEAL teams, like a piece of
Right.
gear or something like that, or hey, can you talk about this character a little more for people that haven't read the previous books? Those are pretty
Mm.
much really the only edits that I get. Never any content really other than that type edits, and never any suggestions, which is interesting because I didn't know at the outset, stepping into this world, if like a big publisher would say, hey, you know what, this is the formula, this is what you have to do, take this out, put this in, do this, this is how you get to be a number one New York Times bestseller or whatever. Zero.
hmm
Zero. Never even a hint of, hey, could you maybe tone down the violence, or hey, do you think about adding a character like this to get more women readers or something like that? Never any hint of anything like that. It's been 100% complete creative control, which I didn't know like at the outset, like if there would be some of those pressures. Zero pressure. So it's wonderful to have
That's
that
awesome.
complete creative control when you sit down. It also means that if something doesn't work, it's all on you.
hmm
100% on you as the author. There's no one else to blame, which is fantastic, which is different than screenwriting. Because when you're adapting something, and my experience in Hollywood is very slim at this point, but
hmm
very different because there are constraints, budgetary constraints, time, length constraints, so many different, just I guess rules might be a little too strict, but anyway, rules-ish anyway,
Mm,
that you have to abide by to get, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever it is, hour-long episodes or 45 minutes to 105 minutes or something like that.
mm-hmm.
Type episodes in. So a lot more constraints and then a lot more people obviously involved as well throughout every
Yeah.
stage of the process. So very different screenwriting, very team oriented. So I can see how when you hear some of these just horror stories of Hollywood of projects going off the rails, I can see how that can happen. There are so many opportunities for that sort of a thing to happen. And then just writing a thriller, totally different. It is just
Mm,
you here. You can do anything you want, no budgetary constraints, no time constraints, and you just make the best story you possibly can.
yeah. Well, I guess I would be very surprised if you were writing a million words for every one of these books because you've been on a very quick turnaround. Like it's been like a book a year or a year and a half or something like that.
Yeah,
Something
book a
crazy.
year, and that's kind of what I figured would happen if the first book took off. Or it's just you have Daniel Silva, and he writes one a year with the Gabriel Alon series. It was Vince Flynn before he passed away, and then after he passed away, Kyle Mills takes over that storyline, and so Brad Thor. So these kind of recurring characters have that's kind of what's expected now. It wasn't always
Mm,
that way. 70s, 80s, you could have a couple years between novels by a John le Carré or a Nelson DeMille or someone like that. I think really Clive Cussler started doing them almost every year in the 70s and then through the 80s, the 90s. I think he's trying to kind of got people on that pace and that expectation of one a year with a recurring character.
mm.
So I kind of expected it, but I'm still trying to find the rhythm as far as schedule goes, just because there's so much going on and just you're juggling a gazillion things all the time. So it's been really complete chaos, I would say, up until this point. And this is now my year to get organized. Now I brought a couple people on in the last few months to help do some other sides, like the e-commerce side of the house, and kind of get things organized for me here or there, do the podcast scheduling, that sort of thing. Um,
Mm,
so I can concentrate on writing because I really need that uninterrupted time to write. And
yeah.
so this is the year to get organized. We'll see how it goes.
So, your writing schedule, do you have like 9 months blocked out in the year that you need to be writing or something like that?
I'm still working that out. It's really just every single second that I have to write
Mm,
or something that builds the readership, builds the audience. That's what I'm doing.
mm,
So I want to get on a schedule where I get up in the morning and take the kids to school, like I just did. Of course, I had to go by the doctor for one of them this morning, and that took longer than expected. So I ran in here at the last second to jump on here. But I want to get on a schedule where I'm writing in the morning and there's nothing else up until, let's say, 2, and then everything else is after 2, so I can just really focus on writing instead of what happens is I'm running around like a crazy person all day doing these different things, constant interruptions, and then I
mm.
start like 10 at night and then go to like 3, 4 in the morning. And really what dictates how long I go is the story and then how long I can keep writing. So that's probably not the healthiest way to do it, because
No.
regardless of how late I stay up, I'm getting up with the kids at like 6:37 and helping my wife get them to school and all that sort of thing.
Mm,
So I need to work on that. So I don't have a schedule yet, but I think this is the year to get closer to having some sort of a more sane schedule, because now there's more writing projects. This year I have my first nonfiction coming out in the fall on
mm.
Beirut. So the 1983 Marine Beirut barracks bombing that comes out
Wow.
in September. There's some other writing projects that haven't been announced yet, and then there's the show. So they're filming it right now, and I'm writing the finale with the showrunner David DiGilio, amazing guy. And there's just more writing projects out
That's
there.
for Dark Wolf.
Dark Wolf, yep,
Yeah.
for the origin story for the Ben Edwards character, and it looks awesome. For
Yeah.
whatever reason, I think there were, because the first show, whatever metrics they're using that they don't share, because it's big kind of data type stuff, big tech, they won't share those with us. But because there is both a second season with True Believer and the spinoff series Dark Wolf, the numbers were pretty good. And so what I've noticed is there are less questions from, let's say, up the chain of command, so all the way
Mm,
up to the top of Amazon and then back down. A lot more questions first season, a lot more, are you sure you need to do this? I don't think this is going to work, that sort of a thing, that you have
right.
to work through. A lot less of that this season, and these scripts are awesome. I am super fired up for Dark Wolf. Like, it's going to be fantastic if the
Sweet.
scripts are, any indication.
Yeah. So how much were you brought in for that writing process, since you didn't write books for Ben Edwards and that's just a complete TV series spinoff from your books?
Yeah, so I created it with the showrunner David DiGilio. So it's created by both of us, and
Hmm.
just from the outset, every part of it, from inception to coming up with the pitch for Amazon to doing the pitch for Amazon. Although I was just kind of there, me and Chris and Antoine were just kind of there as the showrunner. Really pitches it out there, and then we all field questions from Amazon, and then putting the writers' room together, interviewing writers to get that writers' room together,
Mm.
the outline that goes to that writer's room so they can kind of look at it and say, okay, here we go. And then parceling out the different episodes, getting each one of those back, editing those. So I'd say I was very involved in every aspect of it, which is great because I'm always learning and always a student. And I guess my hope is that the screenwriting side of the house, everything I learned there helps writing the novels. And then what I do on the novel, writing the novels helps the screenwriting side of the house. So it's
Yeah.
always a student.
So are you more or less involved with the Dark Wolf series than you were for the Terminalist being turned into a show?
It seems about the same.
Okay.
Maybe a little more on Dark Wolf because at the outset for Terminalist, I'm an unknown entity.
Hmm.
And Chris optioned it. I hadn't even sold one book. So he optioned it in January of 2018. The book didn't even come out until March of 2018. So I don't have any background in Hollywood and screenwriting. Don't know anybody there other than Chris at that point. So I think over the course of putting together the terminal list, everything that I learned, everything that I contributed, you're showing that you add value. So had I not added value, I would not I would not be creating a spinoff series with David DiGilio.
Hmm.
So you kind of prove, I guess, as a new guy, just in anything. Same thing in the SEAL teams, same thing I can assume in any industry. As a brand new person, you have to prove yourself, prove your value. And so I guess I did that throughout the whole season, putting together the terminal list adaptation, and then hence more involvement in Dark Wolf, and then more involvement in True Believer that start
Yeah.
filming for Dark Wolf. So it's been fun. It's been fantastic.
When you're writing these books now going forward, and you can, like, Chris Pratt is playing Reece, and you know that what you write could very well end up on the show verbatim. Does that figure into your writing process when you're like, I could write this scene so grand that they could never afford it? Or should I like tone it down so that like my writing makes it in to the
On the
show?
screenwriting side or on the novels,
When you're
thinking
writing the novel, thinking ahead.
no, I don't really. If there's any influence, it's natural. It's
Hmm.
more. So let's see. As we're filming the first season, Devil's Hand comes out. So the first book that would really have influence from the screenwriting side of the house is the next one, In the Blood. And if people think in those terms as they're reading it, or curious about that sort of thing, I think they will see the influence of the show and the screenwriting on In the Blood and then on the next ones. But not so much from a point of scenes like, hey, can we film this and how much it's going to cost? And Chris is going to be starring in this. Does this make sense? Not that at all. More storytelling wise. So more like that connection to Reese's dad and these kind of
Hmm.
flashbacks to his youth and what makes him who he is today. Those sorts of things, I think, are more what the influence of the screenwriting side of the house has, how that's impacted the books. So I think that's, if there's anything, I think it's that. But yeah, anything's natural. Same thing with audio. So in
Hmm.
audio, it's natural in that I'm friends with Ray Porter, who does the narration, who's an amazing guy.
Hmm.
And so as I'm writing now, I am very cognizant of the fact that I should say someone has a certain accent or right up front rather than mention it 3 pages in when he's already not had one or had a different one, or said someone has like a stutter or they have something that differentiates their character and the way they speak. I need to say that right up front. So because Ray reads it, he just kind of skims it real quick and then he dives in because he wants to narrate the same way that you would as a reader experience it
Hmm.
for the first time. So he doesn't read it, make notes, ask questions about how to pronounce certain things. He just goes. He just does a little quick
Wow.
thing, okay, boom, and he goes in because that's his technique. And I don't think all narrators are like that, but that's just how he does it. So I want to make sure that for him, I mentioned something like that right up front as someone starts speaking. So then
Hmm.
he doesn't have to go back and spend another 30 minutes redoing something. If I all of a
Yeah.
sudden someone has a very thick accent or a light accent and he's given them the opposite of that. So there are things, whether it's the shows or it's narration, that just become part of your experience. But
Hmm.
that foundation upon which to build going forward and hopefully make everything better.
Yeah, it seems like that might only strengthen your writing process, make it more efficient. But it's funny that you brought that up about Ray Porter because so I had originally heard you on Joe Rogan, which is when I heard about the books, and then the series came out. I watched the series, and then I was like, all right, I need to read these books. And I was like, I'm not gonna start with book one though because I just watched the season, and like at this point, I was just not. I was just getting back into books, and so I was like, I need to start with something fresh. So I started with True Believer. And then I read all the way through, and then I hit the terminal list once I had nothing else to read. And I noticed, and it was like jarring for me, that Katie had an accent. Katie Baranek had an accent in the first book, but not in the other ones. And I was hearing you say that. I'm like, is that why? Did he just expect her to
I
have
don't know
one, or?
exactly because I think I did in the first one. I'll have to go back and look, but maybe I just said an accent, and then he just kind of decides how he's going to do that, and then I only hear it when it's done. Um,
Hmm.
and you're not working hand in hand throughout this whole time, saying, "Oh no, I think you need to tone that down," or "Hey, this is how you say this certain military term," or whatever else. It's not like that at all. And now I just texted Ray the other day, and I said, make sure you just reach out if you have any questions about anything. I keep telling myself that I'm going to make notes for him and make a cheat sheet, like especially of new
Hmm.
characters that are coming up. So usually the new characters in these books are the bad guys because the
Hmm.
recurring characters are the good guys, and then the bad guys all get taken out, and then there's a new host, of bad guys for the next one. So I was going to make little notes. So going into it, he would know like how he could see like, oh, I should probably bone up on like how to say some Chinese names, or okay, this guy's going to have a thick accent. This guy is going to sound like he was educated in the UK, that sort of a thing. So I
Hmm.
I didn't because I was just going 1,000 miles an hour, like always. So I didn't get a chance to do that, but eventually I would like to do that and give him a little cheat sheet. But I think yeah, probably just natural for how things go. I wrote in the first book about Rafe Hastings' accent. I wanted it to be it was very light, kind of like a hint. And in my mind, I was thinking more like Mel Gibson in the mid '80s, where there was something there, but you couldn't quite tell unless you looked up and like, oh, he's from Australia. Okay, now I get it.
Hmm.
So that was kind of like his parents would have thick ones, and then he would have this one that was light, like just you knew it was something, but you couldn't quite place it until you knew the backstory, and then you'd say, okay, I got it. So he had a very thick one in the audiobooks. So that's just kind of how everything goes, and there's things are going to morph, and
Yeah.
that's just the way of it.
Gotcha. So the Terminal List series was the first time that I've ever read a book that has jujitsu in it. And I know how hard it is even explaining a move to someone in person. And I've also, for like only 2 or 3 days, I tried keeping a jujitsu journal to try and help myself remember what I learned that day. And it is so hard to write what you are doing. And I'm curious, like, what was your method for writing that to explain it to even someone who doesn't know? And then also, like, do you still do jujitsu? It sounds like you have done jujitsu based on the writing.
Yeah, so I was back in the early 90s, before most people had heard of it, before there was the UFC, any of that thing. I was just into martial arts very early on, came to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu through Jeet Kune Do, which is Bruce Lee's martial art, really a way of thinking more than anything else. And they would incorporate things from, let's say, Western fencing, from wrestling, from all sorts of different martial arts, Filipino martial arts, of course. But in the 90s, they were starting to get into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and incorporate that into the ground fighting side of Jeet Kune Do. So that's where I was introduced to it. And I did that when I got to the SEAL teams. I remember in boot camp pushing at night, we pushed the bunks to the sides, and we had like they're already on the sides. We kind of moved them out of the way, moved some tables out of the way, just made a space in the middle of it. And I remember going against like a high school wrestler, and the guys are awesome, but this is 1996, and I remember he hadn't really had no experience with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He was an amazing wrestler, but it was totally, a different deal. And even when I got to the SEAL teams, there were guys that were just kind of starting to get into it. I remember in SEAL qualification training, just going at it in the dirt up at a place called La Posta, where we do some kind of tactical training up there. And my if you knew back then, like if you just knew a few things, you'd get
Mm,
the mount guard, the triangle, the arm bar, like 4 or 5 different things. Like you were pretty good.
yeah.
And then of course it explodes with UFC, and guys are so good. I mean, amazing now,
Hmm.
absolutely incredible. So I have that base, so I know what it feels like to do these certain things. And actually, I think the boxing and the jujitsu helped me in buds so much, and the cross country running that I did earlier on in life. But when you do that, when you're on the mat and they start sending fresh people in, and you're just on the mat for like an hour or whatever, and they're cycling fresh people through whatever, I don't even remember how, like every 5 minutes or whatever it was,
Hmm.
is tough.
Yeah.
Is super tough. And I remember thinking about that on the runs in buds, or on the swims in buds and SEAL training, and thinking back to that and how difficult that was. And thinking, oh, you know what, this isn't as hard as that. And then I would also put it in relative terms, like, oh, you know what? I guess what I'm not doing. I'm not running over across a beach in Normandy in June
Hmm.
of 1944. So I put things in relative terms. Like imagine you can swim a little bit more. You can run a little bit faster. You can do a few more push-ups. Like this is not hard compared to what most of people had to go through in life up to this point and for generations past. So I thought about those things. But so the jujitsu gives me that foundation. So I know what it feels like to be in that kind of a situation. And then when I'm describing them, sometimes I'll just say triangle. I'll be like, okay, I'm just going to leave it like that. Sometimes I'll say like, okay, triangle, and give a tiny description. Other times I'll give, for people that haven't done that sort of thing, aren't familiar with jujitsu, maybe they don't watch UFC, whatever it is, I'll go into a little more detail, but I try to mix it up so that every single move is not this crazy description that takes 5 paragraphs to describe. Some maybe
Yeah.
are, others aren't. So I kind of switch that up. Kind of similar to describing a scene in general. Sometimes I describe like the violence in detail. Other times you leave it up to the reader, you leave it up to the listener, because what they imagine can oftentimes be worse than what you would describe. Or you
Mm.
can have two people talking about it after the fact, like an investigator comes in and they're describing a crime scene. So there's different ways to describe violence, so it's not always the same for the reader. And they're not like, okay, here comes the scene, it's going to be this. Okay, here comes another one, it's going to be this. No, sometimes it doesn't. You don't know what's going to happen. The guy enters the room, okay, and then cuts to another chapter, and now it's like, let's say, a police investigator in there going through it, trying to figure out what
Mm.
happened, or two people talking about what happened after the fact. So I try to mix it up, whether it's describing the intricacies of a move or a scene or a chapter in general.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really cool, and I liked what you said about when you're in buds and putting things into perspective. And it's funny because I do the jujitsu perspective one too. Like anytime I'm feeling lazy and I don't feel like squatting at the gym, I'm just like I tell myself throughout the entire set, this is not as hard as jujitsu. It's not as hard as jujitsu, and it
Seriously.
gets me through it.
Nice.
But yeah, that's also great perspective thinking about all the other time periods in Normandy. On the topic of the difficulty of buds, I thought about this the other day. I knew I had to ask you, what do you think you would be able to accomplish easier right now? Would it be going through buds again, or becoming another New York Times best-selling author under a pseudonym?
Probably another New York Times bestselling author. I think my time for buzz was past. My window has closed into doing anything like that again. But yeah, people go through difficult things all the time, in life.
Hmm.
That's one that you kind of choose to do. And whether it's buds, or it's, let's say, Ranger School, or Army SF School, the Q course. I think people throughout history, especially at that age, between the ages of, let's say, if you go way back in time, let's say like 14 and 18, or 14 and 16, like more modern times, more like 17, 18, and let's say 20, 21, 22, like that time frame, there's something that that it's very natural for all of us, I think, to want to be tested. And because you used to have to prove your value to the tribe. You go back far enough, you had to get tested because to survive, that tribe needed you to add value to continue on essentially the lineage, the community, the tribe. So I think it's very natural, something in us to, and whether it's military or something else, there is this calling, I think, to be tested, especially in those ages. So
Hmm.
it's a long way of me saying that at this age, I don't feel the need to be tested like that anymore. I'm good. It was a
Right.
good run, but yeah, I think that's in the past.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Um, so something funny. One of the friends I spoke about earlier, he is a pilot in the Navy. And I thought I'd share this story with you. It's hilarious. So I told him about these books, and then he's on deployment in Italy. And he looked everywhere, couldn't find the books. And he told his girlfriend about it, that he was struggling to find them. And he just got pissed off and ordered them on Amazon. And then he got more mad because only one showed up. And he had no clue that his girlfriend bought him the first one, sent it to him, and he didn't see the packaging or anything. So he's blown through this book, doesn't say thank you to her, doesn't let her know that it came in because he thinks this is his book. You inadvertently almost caused a conflict
Oh
between
man,
fellow Navy servicemen.
That's oh man, I do get people from overseas that have contacted me and that sort of thing. I try to send out as many books as I can, especially military, police, law enforcement, or firefighters.
Mm,
So it is really cool to know that those communities out there read these and that they resonate. So that's pretty humbling.
yeah. You don't seem like you're a super nerd in the sense of Dungeons and Dragons. Did you ever play Dungeons and Dragons as a kid or anything
I
like
did
that?
not. I did not.
Gotcha. Yeah, I figured. Do you know much about it?
I know. I grew up in the '80s, so I remember the
Okay.
role playing
Yeah.
games. I remember the in the toy stores, the little figures, and I remember the
Hmm.
boxes and stuff. But it was always a bit of a mystery to me.
Yeah. So basically, you have like the dungeon master who either runs like a pre-made story or they make one up and then they run it for their characters. But I wanted to get into trying to run one of these games, and I was like, I'm taking the terminal list. Like, so I adapted your book series into
Nice.
like a fantasy thing, and lucky for me, Coronado already sounds like a kingdom in
Yeah,
like
it
a
does.
fantasy world, and so yeah, they got the evil wizard partnering with the with like the military commander to make a spell that makes people more efficient on the battlefield, and now
No
everyone's trying to
way.
get killed off. And yeah, and so like I was, I was running this game for my friends, and I'm like, I wonder if anyone's gonna notice. And they didn't. I had to let them know. I'm like, yeah, so if you just want to know what's gonna happen, just you can watch that show
Oh man,
or
that's
read the
wild.
books.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. That is awesome. I think
Yeah.
there was a role-playing game. I think they had a James Bond role-playing game in the '80s, like based off the Dungeons and Dragons type formula. And
Hmm.
then I think Tom Clancy had one before. So Red Storm Entertainment was like his kind of gaming side, I think. Maybe it's
Hmm.
for the books and everything. I'm not entirely sure. But I believe that before the video games, that there was a role-playing type of game for either Hunt for Red October or Red Storm Rising. I believe
Hmm.
people can check me and tell me that I'm wrong because I'm going back in the memory banks to like 1985, 86, 87 for to pull on that one.
So, since this is book seven, do you know how James Ree's story ends? Have you thought that far ahead?
Uh, not ends. I have a lot of when I first started, I wrote down a bunch of different like one-page executive summaries, and
Mm,
I chose the one that I thought was going to be the would resonate the most with readers. That would be the most hard-hitting out of the gate, the most primal, the most visceral. And the one I wanted to write was Savage Son, so the third one, because in sixth grade I read Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell, which was written a short story written in 1924, and I always wanted to one day write a novel, even in sixth grade based on that. And so Savage Son was the one I wanted to write first, but I knew that the characters weren't quite ready for that yet. And so I had to introduce them to readers through the terminal list. And then even at the end of the terminal list, I knew that they were not ready for Savage Son. So I had to take James Reece on this journey of redemption. And I thought my editor was going to take out like the first whole third of that novel where James Reece is spoiler alert for anyone that hasn't read them or wants to and doesn't want to know what happens. But as he goes across the Atlantic, I thought that perhaps my editor would take all that out or recommend or
Hmm.
suggest like, hey, but no, she didn't even mention it. And I think that's something that is quite different about these books, especially the transition between Terminalist and Savage Son, having True Believer in there and having this character go on this journey of violent redemption. And that was the guiding principle, the guiding theme for that novel was redemption. And then I added violent to it. So I have a little sticky note that I put on my computer with a theme that helps guide the writing process. So everything comes back to that theme, whether directly or indirectly. And so violent redemption was that theme. And so I thought it would be disingenuous to the reader just to pick up James Reece and drop him into the next storyline, although that, like commercially, that might have been what maybe most people would have done. But I
Hmm.
wanted him to go on this journey. I thought I cannot to honor the story and in turn respect the reader and the audience after the traumatic events of the Terminalist. He can't just get dropped into this next situation. He needs to go on this journey, and I'm going to take the readers on this journey with him. So after True Believer, the second novel, then I was like, okay, now it's time for Savage Son. Um,
Yeah.
so I wrote down all these different ideas. Some of them have become books, some of them have not. Some of them have become morphed based off what's happened to the characters over the preceding novels. So I don't have an end. I don't have an end, but I
Hmm.
have a lot of stories.
Gotcha. Whenever it does end, do you see yourself writing maybe either another series or maybe even with the interest of Dark Wolf, like maybe more spin-off series from James Reese's original storyline?
I was very deliberate in that I put characters into these novels from that were multi-generational that would be interesting to me and to readers. So I dropped in the Hastings family,
Hmm.
multi-generational there. I mentioned Reese's father and grandfather in the first book and mentioned them in other books as well, so that because I think I got that from Stephen Hunter from reading Stephen Hunter's Bob Lee Swagger series. So Stephen Hunter has done three generations of the Swagger clan right now, perhaps more in the future. And so I think I got that from him. Because I'm trying to think of another book. I'm sure there are, but in the thriller genre that have done things like that. And Stephen Hunter's the one that resonated with me anyway. And as a reader, I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about just single sentences that he put in there, and I love writing single sentences that, because growing up, I would read, let's say, David Morrell or Stephen Hunter or Nelson DeMille, and I would read a sentence and say, oh, I'd like to know more about that. And they didn't explain more of it. It was either like assumed that you knew or was like for those, just for somebody. Maybe you couldn't even look it up back then, but it was for people in the know, and maybe they got it from a source or something like that. But I
Hmm.
loved that kind of mystery and intrigue that didn't take away from the story, added to it because of the context. So you could figure out, why that line was in there, that paragraph was in there because of the context, and you didn't need it fully explained to you. And I like that.
Hmm.
As a reader, I like that. So I tend to do that as well. Sometimes my editor will say, "Can you explain this a little more?" And sometimes I will, and sometimes I won't. But but I like that as a reader, so I tend to do that too. So I did put multi-generational characters in there that would be interesting to readers, and I do get asked about that a lot. Are you going to write a Tom Reese spinoff? Are you going to write a Hastings family spinoff? Are you going to do these sorts of things? And they're in there for a reason, that's for sure. The S to develop the character and describe his backstory, because I do think it adds to that character development to know where someone came from and kind of
Hmm.
what their lineage is. But then also for the opportunity to possibly explore those characters in depth in the future. And we'll see. We'll see. It would be very nice to go back, because everything that I write now has to take into account that all these cars have like a GPS type thing in them now. Your phone has a GPS in them. Your watch might have a
Right.
GPS in it. There's video cameras everywhere. Information is available at the touch of a button. Communication is at your fingertips almost all the time. So you have to really think about that when you're writing any sort of spycraft or any sort of espionage or anything in this world. That technology has to be taken into account. And so going back, let's say to the 80s, to the 70s, to the 60s, to the 50s, to the 40s, very cool to not have to think about that in all that you do when you're writing in this kind of a genre where people are hunting people and
Mhm.
chasing each other around the globe and all this, communicating in ways that the NSA can snoop in on at any time, that Google certainly
Yeah.
knows. Like all this data and this communication, it's out there, it's collected. And so you have to think about that. Well, if you go back to the 80s or the 70s or whatever else, someone can be running around and trying to gets to that payphone and doesn't have a quarter or whatever. Like all those, that would be really fun to go back and set something in those time frames. So I would let's say not be surprised if that happens at some point.
Yeah. Well, and especially now with the James Reece books, and this is slight spoiler, just with the quantum computer AI that was introduced, like that's a whole like can of worms, like that. So many implications of like what could be achieved for him or against him because of that. And so when I read that, I was like, oh God, like this just sounds like it's got to be so hard to write about now because, and like I know you do extensive research and interviews with people to make sure that what you're saying tracks as good as you think it can. It feels like a massive undertaking to try and be a crazy assassin in a world with something like that, and just the implications on terrorism and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, and you have to really think that stuff through, and that's
Mm-hmm.
bandwidth. That it gets that you're thinking about that side of the story. So I introduced Alice, that AI quantum computer, in the blood, and then after introducing her, I wanted to make sure that in the next book I didn't rely on her and her abilities. So I very intentionally she's in there, but she's not in there as essentially a main type of a character. I knew I'd have to go back to her eventually because now she's introduced to the universe and she's in ours as well. All my research, I would be shocked if what I describe in the blood and what I describe in this current novel, Red Sky Mourning, if it's not almost exactly the way I describe.
Yeah.
Some of the people that I interviewed said that if they told me any more, my book would go into the science fiction category. So, and things have only gotten increased exponentially over the last few years since I wrote that book. Just technology is it's moving forward so fast. But I wanted to make sure for Only the Dead, the one that came after In the Blood, that I didn't rely on her like for people out there who watch Knight Rider in the 80s, and he had this watch he could call his car anytime, hey kid, need help, that sort of a thing. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't relying on the quantum computer's ability to solve problems rather than James Reese's. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't using it as a crutch. I guess that might be a better way to put it. I was
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that I was thinking these things through and not sacrificing story for the ability of this computer. Just like easy button. Oh, I can't figure this out. Okay, the computer will solve it. So I want to make
Right.
sure I didn't do that in the next book. So that was very deliberate. And then this book, this computer comes back, and I had to get very creative with how I bring her back into things and how I bring James Reese back into things.
Mm-hmm. When you were talking about Savage Son, and I know you've talked about this a lot on your podcast, that you can't really discuss James Reese without the amazing torture that you add into the books. And every time I talk to someone who hasn't watched the show or read the books, they're like, they look at me like I'm like a serial killer when I say that it's the best thing ever. And I typically hate torture scenes and stuff, but I'm like, you don't understand how much these people deserve what's coming to them. It's so delicious. Do you have to go and put yourself into a dark place mentally before you write those things, or is this more like an exciting thing? Like I would imagine like the way that people who make the Mortal Kombat fatalities, probably gets excited to design those.
Yeah, it's more so that I wanted to make sure that I wasn't writing something that was just, oh, shoot him in the other leg type of a thing. Like, okay,
Right.
that I wanted to get creative and I wanted to bring in these different interrogation torture scenes in a way that weren't just for torture or violence sake, but spoke to one of the two characters involved, whether the background as a student of warfare or something in the last book, something that the Russians did, and now you're doing it to a Russian who's done it to someone before. So there were these kind of cultural touch points as well. So I wanted to make sure that those things were in there and have them be very creative, but not just violent, if that makes sense. I wanted them to be thoughtful. I wanted it to be
Hmm.
thoughtful violence. And that was something that from the very beginning that I thought about because I've read so many of these books growing up. I'm a fan of film and television and really a student of this, really from the fan perspective, though. And so I just didn't want to have a character out there that had a new name, but was pretty similar to other characters. I wanted to really think this violence through and have that part of it differentiate the character in the books from maybe others out there. So a lot of thought goes into that. A lot of thought goes into the torture scenes. And it's not just like, oh, I'm just going to Google how to torture someone and pick one that I haven't used before. So no, they've all come very naturally and are all very specific to the storyline for a reason, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And probably best not to Google that. Talking about government tracking, especially, I guess, if you're a former Navy SEAL, you probably get flagged for something.
Seriously, I mean, yeah, they're definitely collecting it all.
Yeah. In preparation for this podcast, I went back and listened to all of your book recap ones because I was trying to. It's kind of hard finding the exact scenes online when I was trying to Google it. I was like, I don't know where in the book this is going to be, but I'm trying to refresh the specific one from Savage Son. I'll
That's
just
probably
say
the one
that
people mention more often than not. That's the
yeah,
one.
I'll just say there's a capsaicin injection going on, and I'm curious. Is that like 100% capsaicin? I don't know like what the ins and outs of that is, or is it just like mixed in with water or something like
Right.
that?
Didn't I bring it to a boil or something like that? I have to go back and read it too, because that was so many books ago.
Hmm.
And I don't typically go back and read for those types of things. I'll go back and read for because I don't have a what they call a Bible yet, where you
Hmm.
have, the characters, like say where they went to school, their hair color, their eye color, their age. Like I don't have that yet. I need to make one. But I go back. So I'm like, where did I mention so and so? And I go back and okay, oh, okay, they had blonde hair, they had green eyes, or they had whatever. So I do that, but I don't typically go back and read for exactly how I described, a certain fight scene or torture scene or anything like that. Once those are done, those are done. So I think I had he boiled something, right? I think he had to boil something down. Maybe I'd have to go back and look.
That sounds familiar. What prompted that question was I recently bought bear spray, and I was looking at the bottle and it says 1.1% capsaicin. I was like, Jesus
1.1.
Christ. Like, what did Reece do?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
nuts.
Yeah,
So,
1.1 is how it said, huh? Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. Bear spray would be a good one to use at some point. But I've already used similar, but I'll have to get creative with that at some point. That's a good idea.
I mean, if bear spray makes it into a book, I'm gonna be
Yeah,
over here
yeah.
like, yes.
I try to remember everybody in the acknowledgments that helped along the way.
Heck yeah.
Where I get ideas from. I like to thank everybody. But yeah, if it bear spray comes in, then that's you.
Sweet. um, when you're talking about that book Bible, I heard you during the book recap podcast episodes talking about how you write your bad guys, how their personality gets fleshed out through the dialogue. I'm curious, once you are writing that dialogue and you're kind of figuring out who this character is, do you go and make notes off to the side of like kind of like guides for you to refer back to as you continue writing the book? Like this guy's kind of a douche when it comes to like this topic, and a horrible relationship with his father, and those kinds of things.
I do, but not that detailed. So I have a
Okay.
list of characters at the beginning, and more so it's for the characters that are hard to spell. So newer characters, whether that's a name somebody from the Middle East or a Russian last name or a Chinese name, where you're like, how do you spell? It's like this crazy Russian name that's really long. Like, okay, it's right here. So I have a piece of paper that I do update, and then as I get to know those characters, I'll make notations, but it's not like a paragraph or anything like that. But I
Hmm.
make a slight notation. Or if a character, there's been a couple times where one character has become two, I think. Like I'm like, this one character is not going to cut it as maybe like a sole bad guy, or he wouldn't have this
Hmm.
skill set. He needs somebody else who's also going to have to get dealt with, and they're going to need a personality as well, and they're going to need a backstory as well. So then that, not necessarily a character becomes two, but it kind of splits a little bit. And now a character that I didn't know I needed at the outset is now involved because I need it for the story. Um,
Gotcha.
but I will have a little character list that I have next to me, but mostly it's for spelling. It helps. Even with that, some of these names, I'll still mess it up, like with an autocorrect or something like that. Like it'll do something, and then I
Mm,
do have to go back at the end and make sure that, like in this case, I had a yun, Y-U-N, yin, and a yin, and I mixed those up a couple times, and so I had to go back and fix it near the
mm.
end.
Did you already release a synopsis for Red Sky Morning?
There's a little it's like a paragraph or so, a couple
Okay,
paragraph type thing that gets released when the book goes up on Amazon. There's a little description of it that goes up there. So there's
gotcha.
out there, yeah.
Okay. Just based on that name and then the title, I haven't read the synopsis, but it sounds like China might be involved.
And is
That's that's
involved.
that's
Yep.
exciting.
Yep. Yep. There. I
uh,
mean, when I did the research for In the Blood, so a couple books ago, or sorry, for yeah, In the Blood, when I introduced Alice, as you're researching quantum computing and artificial intelligence, it is very natural to also see where competitors lie as
mm,
far as what they have developed thus far as well. So you're seeing a little bit on Russia and then a whole lot more on China. So as I was doing that research, maybe there's like maybe one sentence or something, maybe in that book, maybe not, maybe I just talked about it in interviews if it came up, but where they are compared to us. And you do hear people talking about that on the news. So back then, we were in the lead. Maybe not on a couple things, uh, in my mind, as I'm researching something that's not China specific, I'm learning about China as well, because in a lot of these
mm,
articles, journals, and the people that I'm talking to, it just comes up very naturally. So in the research for that book, for Alice in particular, which was US centric, I'm also learning a lot about China and their capabilities as far as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, passive targeting, hypersonic weapons, like those things in particular. And then in this one, I kicked this one off with it says it on the Amazon review, so it's not really a spoiler or anything, but with a Chinese submarine.
okay.
So this is 40th anniversary of the Hunt for Red October. So it also kind of was my nod to Clancy and like a thank you to Tom Clancy as well.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to read that. So with, I mean, like with AI computing and stuff like that, that's all very current event stuff. I'm curious, once you've already begun writing the story, you have like the basic idea, I guess, of like where you want to go. How much do you, or maybe you block it out entirely, but how much do you allow influence from current events as you're writing, influence your work?
Oh, I let it influence for sure.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's so what I do is I start out with I like to start with a title because I don't, even if it's going to change, because I don't want to waste bandwidth as I'm typing worrying about a title.
Mm,
I've had good titles up to now, and I don't want to be like, oh, this is book seven. Oh man, I really need a good title for this. Oh wait, go back to the story. I don't want that at all. I want to have one there, even if it's going to change. So it's not just like book seven. It's like title. Okay, boom, story. But I'll come up with like I say, a one-page executive summary. Maybe it's a paragraph to, essentially it's a letter to myself, but it's what you would see on the back of a book cover or or the flap jacket of a book, the description you'd see on Amazon. And then I ask
mm,
myself, is this story worth a year and a half of my life? And if the answer is yes, then I say, okay, if someone was walking by a Hudson News in the airport and they pulled this off the shelf and they opened it up and they read this description, would this be something that interesting enough for them to devote time to, time that they're never going to get back? And if the answer to that is yes or probably, boom, okay, then I'm all in. Then I take that, turn that into the outline, and my outlines are I know where I'm going, so I know the end, and then it's as detailed as possible, but I don't let the outline slow me down. So if I get to a part and I'm like, oh, how is he going to get out of this in part two? I don't let that slow me down at all. I know I have a year to figure it out. It's not like the battlefield where bullets are flying and if I make a mistake, people are going to die. It's like I can sleep on this and I can sleep on
right.
this for weeks at a time. I can write the entire book and still come back to this at the end and not have it quite figured out and then get it. Like I don't let the outline slow me down. So I get it as detailed as I can. usually I know how it starts and where it ends, and a few different scenes that are gonna, help along the way. Have a cast of characters, and then boom, into the narrative. But as I'm writing, things are happening that would influence characters that have these backgrounds. They'd be thinking about these things, and the best example really is the Devil's Hand, because that one was really about what the enemies learned from us over, at that time, almost 20 years at war. So I said,
Mm-hmm.
if I was China, if I was Russia, if I was North Korea, if I was Iran, if I was a super empowered individual, if I was a terrorist organization, what would I have learned by watching the United States and Iraq and Afghanistan and a few other places around the world? And what would I have incorporated into my future battle plans? And so that was the basis. So I started writing. And then COVID hits. And okay, obviously our response to COVID, the enemy isn't just not taking note of how we respond to
Right.
COVID. They're incorporating those lessons into their battle plans. And then we hit a summer of civil unrest. And once again, the enemy is looking at those things and taking notes and figuring out, oh, okay, how do I exploit this division if I am those countries or entities that I just mentioned? So then that got woven in. Very contentious election cycle, obviously. So all of those things get woven in because that's part of the book, especially that one, because the book was about what the enemy has learned and learning. So that
Mm-hmm.
a lot was woven in as I'm writing because all these things are happening. So I didn't just shut down and say, nope, it's just going to be about what they've learned in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nope. And it also happened to be about bioweapons and
Yeah.
bioweapon research. So that was yeah, bioweapons defense. So that was crazy that COVID hit as I was writing a book that was about essentially, a bioweapon. Although there's some twists in there as well.
Mm-hmm. That idea of the enemy learning from us and just observing is incredibly terrifying. And for someone like me who, hasn't served in the military, that was kind of like fuck. Like, I guess they are, like, they could be, like they definitely are, adjusting and,
Yeah,
doing that kind of thing. And so, yeah, it was a very terrifying book, and the timing couldn't have been better
yeah, that
for
was
that
great.
to come out.
Yeah, that one in particular. So they all have elements of that, but that one is probably the best example of something that was I wouldn't say drastically influenced, but was certainly influenced by events that aren't obscure, that are a part of everyone's life and impacted everyone.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, did you change any of your titles of your books? And do you have any off the top of your head that you wouldn't mind sharing?
Yep. So Savage Son was not Savage Son at the outset, and I won't share what it was because I think I'm going to use the title again for something else,
Nice.
probably the book, but something else. So that one started as a different title. Devil's Hand was always Devil's Hand. Terminalist was always Terminalist. True Believer was always True Believer. In the Blood, was that something else? In the Blood might have been something else at the beginning, but not for very long. And then the current and Only the Dead was always Only the Dead. And Red Sky Mourning was something else as well. And but it became Red Sky Mourning fairly quickly after I mentioned to my editor, and she said that title's too long. Like it
Mm-hmm.
was too long of a title, and so it morphed to Red Sky Mourning, which is a much better title anyway. All the titles have multiple meanings, and whether it's dual meaning or it's even more than dual, if it's multiple, I like that. I don't just want to pick something that's like sounds cool or
Mm-hmm.
that no. So a lot of thought goes into these titles, and I've picked them all so far in New York and Simon and Schuster. They tell me that's not always the case with authors. Sometimes it comes from editors or an assistant or
Mm-hmm.
someone else, but I've picked all my titles thus far. I don't know if it'll always be that way if I'll ever run into trouble, but I like to pick the titles because they're also makes it much more personal, I think, also for me anyway. So I like to put a lot of thought into these, and I like them to have multiple meanings.
Yeah, doesn't get much better than the terminal list for multiple meanings. So
Yeah,
that's.
that was right from the get-go. There was never any other title for that one.
Mhm. So I'll let you go here, but I wanted to ask you one last thing about 007. I know you're a pretty big fan of James Bond, and I'm curious. Yeah, got the whole collection right there. With them talking about making more movies, they always do. Who would you cast as the new 007?
It's a very good question. And I'll say that so this is the 007th book, and I went to GoldenEye down in Jamaica where Ian Fleming wrote all the Bond novels, as I wrote this one.
Hmm.
And there in this book, the 007th book, there are references for people who have maybe like seen one Bond movie. Maybe they'll get one of them. And then there
Hmm.
are things that are so obscure that I think even people who have studied every film and read every book and studied Fleming's history and his life, that they might not even get because of the way that I incorporate it in there. But there's something for everybody as far as different levels of Bond and Fleming fandom. And that
Hmm.
was really fun to do. So this is a an homage and a thank you to Ian Fleming as well. But for as far as casting, I don't know, but what I would say is that after the last film, there is obviously an opportunity for them. And if I was doing it, I would go back to the beginning and do the books. I would do them period pieces because the way the last film ended, it's an interesting end to Daniel Craig's run and for the film series in general. Um, but I'd go back and do the books, do them as period pieces, meaning you're going to have James Bond in the 50s, and he's going to be
Hmm.
driving a car from the 30s of Bentley. And it's going to be post World War II with all that entailed, start of the Cold War. And I think doing a period piece would be awesome. I would love to see
Hmm.
that. Will they do it? Probably not. But I think it's also a way to reset the series after the way they ended the last one. And yeah, go back and do the books, do them as period pieces, and be true to Fleming's character and the time period in which they were written. I think that would be a really cool way to keep the series going after the way they ended the last movie.
I agree. I think that would give it, like almost like a defibrillator, like new life into that series because
Yeah.
there are so many films that to someone who's just a casual fan, it's just like, oh, another Bond film. But if it's no, this one's set in the 50s, like that's
Oh, wait,
that's
that's
exciting.
different. Yeah, it's like, wow, this is different. That is definitely a reset. So I think that'd
Yeah.
be another way you could go with it. I mean, they probably won't do either one of these. They'll probably just continue present day type of a thing. But they could also, but Hollywood messes this up most times that they do it, and you go forward. So now you have that Bond from the 70s, 80s, maybe early 90s, and have him present day, aged real time. And so
Hmm.
we're you end up at age 70 type of a thing. And why does he get brought back into something?
Yeah.
But I think there's too many ways to mess that one up, I think, in today's day and age. So going back and doing the period pieces from the 50s would be awesome. I think that'd be really
Right.
cool.
Yeah, I agree. I really hope they do that. Maybe they should bring you on for some writing on that.
If they'll listen to this podcast and they'll do it. And then
Yeah.
some bear spray in there as well.
Heck yeah. There we go. Well, thank you so much, Jack, for coming on here. I can't wait to read Red Sky Mourning when it finally hits that print and is not just a bunch of papers that are unbound. The
Yep. Yep.
madness of 100,000 words,
Yep.
150,000.
Oh man, it was a lot. It was a lot, but that's just what the story took this time. So
Yeah.
it's probably my favorite of all the books thus far, as well. So each one's been my favorite, but I don't know if that'll always be true, but it
Hmm.
certainly is for this one. And
Yeah.
it's also the first one where some of those continuing storylines don't push the story forward where they have in the past.
Hmm.
So it's I guess it would be more standalone than the others, but I don't even like calling them standalones because I think it's a much richer reading experience to go on James Reese's journey with him. But
Hmm.
this is my favorite book to date.
Awesome. I can't wait to see it or read it, I suppose. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much. This is awesome.